Welcome to my channel. My name is Holly, and today I am experimenting with trying to figure out how to make these reward system mason jars that my friend showed me on Etsy, except on Etsy, they were 3D printed. I don't have a 3D printer. So I thought, I think I can make those. So I bought a silicone mold from Amazon. Now that I've made a couple of these, I bought 4 more molds so I can make more at the same time. And I'm just literally experimenting. I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm learning along the way. And so I'm going to share with you things that I learned, things that I would suggest you don't do. I have 6 of these to make because in my classroom, I have 6 groups of students, and I'm going to be using these for quiet rewards. Now on this video, I'm not going to show you how to make all 6 of these, but I am going to show you beginning to end how I made the first 2 and then how I started the third one. So my expectation is that number 2 is better than number 1, number 3 is better than number 2, and by the time I get to number 6, that better be perfection because I am definitely making mistakes along the way. So welcome. This might be entertaining. The mold that I have in front of me has cured epoxy already in it. So I was doing a project. I had leftover epoxy. I just dumped it in the mold before I went to bed and it's cured. So this is the next day and I made a new batch of epoxy and I put some diamond dust in it. So it's pretty personal diamond dust called Glitters or Girl's Best Friend. And I mixed that in with my epoxy and poured it over the top of that epoxy that was already cured. Now at the bottom of the epoxy, I'm going to be using 3 different colors of alcohol inks from Jenn's Crafted Gems. These inks are all from her primary pack. And the 3 colors that I'm using from that pack are White Lucid, Eerie, and Absinthe. Now that my alcohol inks have been dripped where I want them, I'm going to start using my heat gun first on low setting to blow those inks starting with the bottom right hand corner. I want to push some of that white upward into the green and the blue. Blow that up and then mix those around. And once I have a little bit on the low setting, I'm going to switch it to high. And then you don't want to hover your heat gun over your epoxy too close or for too long because you can burn your epoxy. I've also created fish eyes before with my heat gun. With this epoxy that I'm using, this is I almost said Jenn's Crafted Gems. This is Jessica Flynn's epoxy, and I've been using hers for a while now, and I have not had any fish eyes no matter how much heat I have used, but I'm not going to take a chance on that. So then once you have your heat gun and you've blown your alcohol inks where you want them, then I just took the leftover epoxy with the glitter in it that I had and I poured it over the top a little bit to push the colors back down to create more movement. Now I'm using the leftover epoxy, pouring some of those same color alcohol inks into that epoxy, and then pouring those into heart-shaped molds because I'm going to use those to number each of these mason jars after they're all done. These sat for a couple days because I was working and I did not go into my craft room for one of those evenings. And so I think these sat in my mold a little bit too long because they were a little bit harder to take out of my molds. So this is kind of where I started to run into issues when I was demolding my mason jar. If you've watched my other videos where I'm demolding things, you know that I'm very rough on silicone molds. I rip them, I tear them because I burn them or I leave them in too long or whatever reason. I am working on it, so I'm forcing myself to make more of these because I'm getting frustrated and I refuse to give up. I'm not a quitter. I'm very stubborn and I'm going to do this until I can figure out how to do it right. But there were a couple spots on the backside that stuck really, really hard. And I don't know why in just a couple spots the epoxy stuck so hard to the mold. So there were a few little rough areas. Now, if I would have just left it with the rough areas, I would have been fine. Some of the silicone is stuck to the back of it, but it would have been fine. It would have looked okay. It wouldn't have been perfect, but I'm not giving these to anybody. I'm not selling them. I'm keeping them for myself because I'm experimenting. So I should have just left it alone, but I didn't. So what I did is I took my little scraper and I started scraping off those little sections. What made it made those sections really rough, and I could never fully get the silicone that's stuck onto the back of it out of those little grooves. So I just created more of a mess. So I took it upstairs, I washed it, I brought it back downstairs. I looked at it for a long time and I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna start scraping this out. Oh my gosh, why did I do that? So that was a disaster. To cover up my disaster, I thought, well, I'll just take a pen and I'll just start filling in these little grooves. So instead of using like a gray marker, a light colored marker, or a white marker, I used black. Why? I don't know. I don't know why I used black. I have no idea. It was not the right thing to do. So I took a black marker. It wasn't a Sharpie. It was one of those alcohol ink markers. Or actually, I think it could have been acrylic. Anyway, it was just a marker. And I started filling those little grooves in. I didn't like it. So then I took some alcohol, rubbing alcohol, and some acetone, and I started cleaning all the black stuff off. So I got the black marks out of the grooves, but I couldn't get it out completely. And then it looks like there's little black parts smeared all over the little corners and grooves of the entire bottom of the mason jar. So this happened like mistake after mistake because I was trying to fix. So every time I tried to fix a mistake, something else looked worse. And then I tried to fix that, and then something else looked worse. And I was getting frustrated, but I didn't quit. So this is as good as it gets after all of that was cleaned up, and then I resanded the inside of it, and you can see the little black smear marks on like the edges of the acrylic, of the epoxy, and I was over it. At this point, I was just experimenting to mess up. I don't know what else to say. So I thought, okay, well, at least let's make this shiny again. So it's going to be shiny with the black smear marks, whatever. Okay, let's make it shiny. So then I put some UV resin on there. I shined that backside up again, and I was okay with it. It's fine. It's fine. Everything's fine. And I didn't record how I cut the top of this mason jar because to insert something into the top, you can't have a closed lip. You have to have it open. So I'll show you on number 2 how I did that. So now that I have everything shiny again, now I have to cut out one of those transparent film sheets to the size of the mason jar, just like I did my little shaker keychains on the previous video. I'll make sure I link the shaker video at the end of this one. So after you cut your film to size, you need to put a rim of UV resin around the edge and then put your film on top of it and then cure it with your UV lamp. After I took the lamp off and I was sort of looking at the back of it, the transparent film was not sturdy. And so I could see that getting damaged really easily, when it's magnetized to the board or if kids touch it or if it falls down or whatever. So I wanted to stabilize the back with UV resin. And so I poured UV resin all over the back. I rubbed it so that it went to the edge, covered the lip of that transparent film, and then cured it again with my UV lamp. And everything was going great until it wasn't. Why? Why is it foggy? I thought, oh, it must be foggy because it's still hot. I'll just let it sit and cool off a little bit. Nope, it's still foggy. Next day, nope, it's still foggy. It's still foggy. I don't know why. I was really annoyed. So whatever, let's just move on. So now I'm applying the magnets. I'm using UV resin to secure the magnets to the back. I'm doing 2 magnets toward the top and 2 magnets toward the bottom. And the magnets went great. That process was fine. And here I'm just testing it to make sure it sticks and to make sure that I have enough of an opening to drop my little chips. These are actually buttons, but I'm calling them chips into the back without them falling out. And it's perfect. They fall in there just like, what is it? Plunko? Clunko? Clinko? What is the game where you drop the little round piece in and it drops, and you get so many points. That's what it's kind of like when you're dropping the buttons in. So perfect. I'm happy with it. Let's move on. All right, last step before I begin mason jar number 2. I just measured the height and width of this heart, and then I just cut out numbers 1 through 6, and I'm going to apply those to the hearts and glue those with E6000 right onto the mason jar. So that marks my groups. Once I have all 6 done, I will take them to school and we will start keeping track of those quiet groups. Mason jar number 2. Okay. I did not want my epoxy to stick when I was demolding it this time. So what I did is I took liquid latex. I know lots of people have allergies to latex, so this is not for everybody, but so far I do not, knock on wood, have allergies. So I'm using liquid latex, and I'm going to just run a layer of latex over all of those grooves and ridges, get rid of any possibility that my epoxy is going to stick and not demold. So I went ahead and I applied it, and it was not drying fast enough for me, but it wasn't, it was, you could tell that it was curing. And so I went ahead and I poured my epoxy over the top of the latex that wasn't completely dry, and I got lucky. It turned out. With liquid latex, as you're applying, if you have a big area like this, it starts to dry on you and it starts to pull like these rubbery stringy pieces. And then so what I ended up with is just a really bumpy section, or actually the whole thing is bumpy, but that's okay. So it's not completely dry, but like I said, I poured the epoxy over the top of it anyway, and I lucked out because the next morning it came off beautifully. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. I'm going to apply my alcohol inks. Now for this first pour, I did pour a little bit too much, so I didn't have enough space to add more epoxy to push down my alcohol inks like I did on the first one. So this design didn't turn out as cool looking as the first one, but at least the colors match. So I'm doing the same thing, applying the inks, using my heat gun, pushing it up. So I'm going to fast forward and skip to the end of this one. So this is the next morning. You can see those alcohol inks really shifted and they sort of moved into the center, into like a vertical point, and it's fine. I don't love it, but it's all right. I'm going to keep it anyway. So then I demolded it, and then on the back side, you can see the latex that was still a little bit damp when I poured the epoxy, and watch how easily it peels off. Da-da-da, perfect. That was perfect. So it is rough and bumpy, so I'm going to go ahead and apply UV resin to that section anyway, so I'm not worried about it. Now this is how I take off that top section. So as it is right now, there's no way I could put magnets on this, attach it to my whiteboard, and have any room or space to drop in my little buttons or my tokens. So I have to either saw off the top, cut it off, or whatever. I don't have a saw. I don't have any sort of fancy little cutting machine. All I have is a hand sander, an orbital sander, and I have a drill. So I am going to use a jewelry drill bit to poke holes all along the top edge of that and then drill out that top piece. So is it smart? No. Can I ruin my drill bit? Yes. Did I do it anyway? You betcha. Once I have all those holes in there, I'm just going to take my drill and I'm just going to push in and out as I run it down along, kind of like connecting the dots, and this piece will fall right out. So, I mean, if you have a saw, that would be the best thing to do, or if you trust yourself with a craft knife. I don't, because if you saw this video earlier, I had a Band-Aid on my finger, and before that I had masking tape on my finger, and that's because when I was doing this to the first one, I sliced my finger pretty deep with my craft knife. So I'm not using my craft knife, I'm using my drill, because for me, it's the safest route to go. You can probably tell that this epoxy is still very bendy, pliable. I did this before my epoxy was 100% cured because I wanted it to be easier to cut into. If I would have waited until it was totally rock hard, solid cured, it would be harder for me to use my drill to cut it out. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. And I'm going to lay my mason jar epoxy object flat on the table when I'm done and just let it sit and reshape itself. After that mess was cleaned up, I took my 60 grit sanding block and I just sanded to smooth out the edges at the top to make sure that nothing was going to catch or, poke me or look too, ugly. So I'm just sanding it out to smooth out those surfaces. After I sanded it, I did the same thing as previous. I put UV resin on the inner section of this mason jar, cured it, and now I'm cutting out or tracing and then cutting out the transparent film. I am getting a little smarter with number 2. I'm using tape to tape down the film. Number 1, to make it easier to hold it into position so I don't trace it crooked. Number 2, because once I peel off that tape, the film that is over the top of the transparent, you have your transparent film, and then you have another thin protective sheet film over the top of it. So once I trace this and I peel off that tape, the film is just going to come right off with it. Remember that first one, when I put the film over the back of it and then put a layer of UV resin over the whole surface area of the backside, it got foggy. So this time I thought, well, maybe it got foggy because it wasn't sanded. I don't know. So I sanded this piece of film, transparent film, before I attached it to the backside of the mason jar. So now I have that rim of UV resin. I'm going to attach the film. I'm going to cure it, and then I'm going to put an entire layer of UV resin over it again and cure it. And this time we'll see if it gets foggy. What do you think? Yes? No? What do you think? Also, when you sand that film, don't sand the inside of it because you're not going to be able to shine that back up. Just sand the outside of it because the outside is the only place it's going to get the UV resin, and the UV resin is what's going to make it shiny. So now I'm just sticking a brush inside of it because with number 1, when I put the UV resin on it and then cured it, it sort of collapsed a little bit. And so I'm putting the tip of a brush in there because it's about the same size as the opening, and I don't want that film to collapse once the heat hits that UV resin and it kind of shrinks it a little bit. So I don't want any collapsing. That's just going to hold it open and make sure it keeps its shape. So I'm applying my UV resin to the back side of it, which you can see it's already making it shiny. And here's the test. Fingers crossed. Ta-da! No fogginess. So once I sanded it, it took away the issue. Is that going to work with number 3? I don't know. There's probably going to be something else that goes wrong with number 3. So applying the resin, applying the magnets. I didn't have any issue with that on number 1. So I'm just doing the exact same thing I did before. And then attaching number 2. This is permanent vinyl, so I'm not putting any epoxy or UV resin over the top of it. I'm just putting the number on the heart. Hopefully not too many hands will be handling these. Hopefully it'll just be me. And I'll take care of them every year, so I'm not too worried about it. So I'm putting number 2 on. I'm going to glue that to the same position I did as number 1. A little bit of glue spilled out over the edge, so I'm just going to get a Q-tip with some rubbing alcohol and clean that up. Number 1 and 2 are done. Number 3, I'm just going to prep it in this video. So I'm going to take it one step further to try to correct a mistake that I had with both number 1 and 2. Not a mistake, but a trouble area, I guess. I don't want to have to use my drill every time and cut out that little piece. I don't want to use a knife. I don't want to use a craft knife. I want to try to figure out a way to prevent that from happening. So I'm taking a little piece of, it's like your, when you go to get your nails done and they have the little squares and they put the acetone on to take off your nails. It's that little fabric piece. Almost feels like felt, but it's not felt. I don't know what it's called. You can get it at any makeup store or Amazon, whatever. I am taking that and I'm just folding it to make it the same height as that, the rim around the bottom. I don't want that section to be filled in, but I do want the section above that to fill in with epoxy because I do want some epoxy on the lip of it. I just don't want epoxy to fill in the whole depth of it, if that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense. So I just stuck that little fabric piece in there. And then I am pouring latex, liquid latex over the top of it, and I'm giving it time to settle and set a little bit before I pour more and play with it. So I'm just watching it. I want to make sure it doesn't spill out over the edge. I want to make sure that it just sets right around that little fabric piece that I put in there. and I just keep pouring more until I feel like I have good coverage. And I'm using Q-tips to pull any of those areas that started to spill over, push them back up to where they needed to be, and just keep going back and forth like that until the latex starts to set and I feel like it's not going to have any more movement. So once that's done, and again, this latex is not completely dry, but I'm going to pour the epoxy over and cross my fingers and hope it works again, because it worked with number 2, whatever. So I'm just going to give it a go, see if it works a second time, see if I get lucky a second time. Pour all of that epoxy over the top of it, and then use my alcohol inks like I did before to create a new design. And same thing, push it with the heat gun up and then pull it down and pour some extra epoxy over the top of it to continue pushing it downward. And done. Number 1 and 2, I magnetized them to a whiteboard and propped it up so that you could see how these buttons drop into the mouth of those mason jars. So I'm not being super careful as I'm dropping those buttons in, so you can see that they're not spilling out over the edge. So I'm pretty happy with how those fall into them. And here's the side view and the back view. You could probably fit like 25, 30 buttons in there depending on the size. Please let me know if there's any questions. Of course, I have 6 of these to make, so 3 more to go after the one that I'm working on now. Leave any comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I was able to teach you something.